The tree had been dead for 40 years, maybe longer. Its trunk had the color of old bone, pale and smooth in the places where bark had long since peeled away, and where bark remained it was black and fissured, split open like something that had decided to stop pretending. The branches reached upward and outward in the way dead branches do, not growing but persisting, hanging on through a stubbornness that had nothing to do with life. Crows liked it. They would sit along the upper arms in rows sometimes, 7 or 8 of them, not calling, just watching the meadow below with the patient attention of creatures that understood what the tree had once been used for. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to Marcus Cole had worked the Blackwood Ridge Wilderness Corridor for 11 years, and he had passed that tree on foot and on horseback more times than he could count. It stood at the eastern edge of a clearing about 3 miles from the nearest trailhead, just off the creek drainage where the trail bent north toward the high country. He knew it the way he knew all the landmarks in his district, practically and without sentiment. It was a navigational reference, nothing more. When he told hikers they were about 2 miles out, he meant 2 miles from the hanging tree, though he never called it that to their faces. He called it the dead cottonwood. It was simpler. The locals called it the hanging tree, had always called it that, and when Marcus first transferred to this district he had asked his supervisor about it, and gotten a response that was mostly a shrug. Old business, Hendricks had told him. Happened before anyone's time. Don't go digging. Marcus Cole was not, by nature, the kind of man who dug. He was 38 years old, and had spent his adult life in service to the kind of work that required patience over ambition and presence over noise. He had grown up in a small town in eastern Oregon where his father had worked the county roads and his mother had kept books for a livestock feed operation, and neither of them had any particular reverence for history or mystery or the idea that the past owed the present any kind of explanation. You did your work. You went home. You were grateful for the quiet. He had taken this posting after his divorce, partly because it was remote and partly because the solitude it promised matched something in him that had been looking for permission to retreat. His daughter Lily was 6 when he moved to the Blackwood station house, and she was 17 now, and in the intervening years she had visited in the summers and grown into someone he admired and did not entirely understand, the way fathers sometimes don't understand daughters who are braver than they are. She asked questions he couldn't answer. She wanted to know about the tree. She had heard about it on her 3rd or 4th summer visit, from the woman who ran the general store in the nearest town, a woman named Darlene Vasquez, whose family had been in the valley for 4 generations and who spoke about old things with the casual authority of someone who had absorbed them through proximity rather than study. Darlene had told Lily about the tree the way you might tell a teenager about anything uncomfortable and true, matter-of-factly, watching the face for reaction, respecting whatever came back. A man had been hanged there sometime in the 1890s, Darlene said. Maybe more than one. Maybe the land held something worth paying attention to. Lily had come home that evening and asked her father what he knew, and Marcus had said not much, which was true, and Lily had said that seemed like something worth knowing, which was also true, and Marcus had not disagreed, but had not pursued it either. He was good at not pursuing things. It was a skill that had served him reasonably well and cost him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The summer Lily turned 17, she came to stay for 3 weeks in July, and on the 2nd day she walked the 3 miles to the hanging tree alone before Marcus was awake. He found her there when he went to check the creek gauge at the upper meadow, sitting at the base of the trunk with her back against the pale wood and a notebook open on her knee, looking up at the branches in the particular way she had of regarding things that interested her, as though she were filing them. You walked out here alone, he said. I know the trail, she said. I know you know the trail. He sat down in the grass nearby, setting his pack down, telling himself he wasn't upset though, he was something adjacent to it, something closer to afraid. How long have you been here? Hour maybe. She looked at the notebook, then back up at the tree. Did you know there are old cuts in the bark up on the main limb? Rope cuts. Real ones. Deep. You can see them even from down here if you look at the right angle. He looked. He had never looked, not specifically, not for that. There were 2 parallel grooves in the lowest main limb, smooth-edged and deep, the kind of wear that comes from something tied and then underload. Rope. Old rope, long gone, but the memory of it carved into the wood. Yeah, he said. I can see them. Lily wrote something in her notebook. She had been keeping naturalist journals since she was 12, recording species and weather and the kind of observations that most people walk past. The journals were careful and detailed, and reading them was one of the things that made Marcus understand his daughter better than any conversation he could think of. She wrote the way she thought, which was more than he could say for himself. Darlene Vasquez told me a man named Elias Cutter was hanged here, Lily said. 1897. She said he was innocent. Marcus looked at the tree. He had not known the name. He had not known the year. He had managed to work this land for 11 years without knowing either of those things. And sitting there in the July morning with his daughter looking up at the rope cuts in the old bark, he felt the particular shame of willful incuriosity. She said there was a trial, Lily continued, but it wasn't much of one. She said the Cutter family disputed the verdict for decades, and then just kind of ran out of family. She said the last one was a son who left in the 1940s, and nobody knows what happened to him. Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then, how does Darlene know all this? Her grandmother knew people who knew people. That's how history works out here. He looked at his daughter, this 17-year-old who had more curiosity in one hand than he had cultivated in 11 years. She was writing again, not looking at him, comfortable in the silence. He thought about what it meant to work a piece of land for over a decade and not know its name. Not the scientific name, not the ecological designation, but the human name, the one earned through suffering and wrong and the particular weight that accrues to certain places when they are used badly. I'll ask Darlene what she knows, he said. Lily looked up. You've never asked her? No. She considered this. Not a judgment, just consideration. Okay, she said. Good. He asked Darlene the following morning, driving the 7 miles into town for his weekly resupply, and Darlene set down the jar of honey she was pricing and looked at him with the expression of someone who had been waiting a long time for this particular conversation. Elias Cutter, she said, 42 years old in 1897, came to the valley in 1884 from someplace east, never said exactly where, people assumed Missouri or thereabouts. Worked timber for a couple years, saved enough to buy 40 acres on the ridge where Blackwood Creek bends. Good land, timber and pasture both, water rights. He worked it alone mostly. Quiet man. Church on Sunday. Stayed out of disputes. She was reciting this from memory in the way people recite things that have been told to them so many times they become structural, part of the architecture of how you understand where you come from. 1895, a man named Harlan Price started a grazing operation in the valley, Darlene went on. Brought money from back east, brought cattle, brought enough political connections that the county assessor and the sheriff both thought it was wise to be friendly with him. Within 2 years, he had claims on half the decent grazing land in the valley and was working on the other half. Elias Cutter had 40 acres Price wanted badly, because Cutter's land sat between 2 parcels Price already owned, and joining them would double his usable range. Marcus leaned on the counter. Cutter wouldn't sell? Wouldn't sell. His daughter said he was offered 3 times market value and turned it down. Said he built the fences himself and buried his dog on that land and wasn't selling it to a man who didn't work his own cattle. Darlene paused. That's a quote. According to the family, anyway. What happened? A man named Burl Sims, one of Price's hands, was found dead in the creek drainage in September 1897. Shot. The sheriff, a man named Orton who owed Price considerably, by all accounts, arrested Elias Cutter within the week. The evidence was a rifle found on Cutter's property that Orton claimed matched the caliber of the wound, and testimony from 2 of Price's other hands that they'd heard Cutter threaten Sims in a dispute over fence lines the previous month. Marcus was quiet. The honey jar sat between them on the counter, unlabeled, the color of old amber. The trial lasted 2 days, Darlene said. Cutter's attorney was a man named Potts who was known as a drinker and who by some accounts spent the second day of the trial visibly impaired. The jury deliberated 4 hours. Cutter was found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang. He was executed on a Thursday in October 1897 under that cottonwood in the clearing, which was apparently used for executions at the time because it was outside of town and out of sight of the women and children. Was he guilty? Darlene picked up the honey jar and turned it in her hands. His daughter Clara never believed it. Clara was 19 in 1897, had a baby son, no husband present. After the hanging, she filed formal complaints with the county, with the state, wrote letters to the territorial governor. Nothing came of it. She maintained until she died. 1938. I have her death date written down somewhere. That 2 days before Burl Sims was killed, a man named Asa Webb came to their property and offered Elias a deal from Price. Sign the land over or face trouble. She said her father laughed and sent the man off. She said she saw the man's face and could have identified him anywhere. Did anyone listen to her? Darlene set the jar down. What do you think? Marcus looked at the window, at the street, at the ordinary valley town going about its ordinary morning. What happened to the land? Price took it. 6 weeks after the hanging. Clara contested it in court and lost. She had no money for a real attorney, and the judge was another man with reasons to stay friendly to Harlan Price. The land transferred to Price's operation. Clara took her baby son, name was Samuel Cutter, and left the valley. Went north, people thought. Oregon, maybe Washington. She never came back. Marcus drove back to the station house with his supplies in the truck bed and Darlene's account in his head, and he sat at the kitchen table for a long time without unpacking anything. He thought about 11 years of walking past a tree without knowing its name. He thought about Lily sitting at the base of it with her notebook, looking up at rope cuts and old bark. He thought about a woman named Clara who had written letters that went nowhere and taken her baby north into the silence. That swallows people who have no one left to speak for them. He thought about the land itself. 40 acres on the ridge, timber and pasture both, water rights. Price's operation had folded sometime in the 1920s according to Darlene, the family never staying past the second generation, and the land had passed through several hands since then, changed with the county multiple times, and was now held by a trust connected to a timber company that had not actively worked it in over 2 decades. It sat in that particular limbo that certain parcels of western land occupy, owned on paper, neglected in fact, reverting slowly toward the condition it had been in before anyone claimed it. Marcus was not a man who thought about land in terms of justice. He was not, by temperament or training, someone who looked at a parcel on a county map and felt the accumulated weight of what had happened there. He was a ranger. He counted elk. He monitored creek levels. He checked campfire permits and reported illegal dumping, and did his work with the steadiness of a person who had decided that steadiness was the same as virtue. But something in him had cracked open under that cottonwood, sitting in the grass while his daughter wrote in her notebook, and the crack wasn't closing. He did not tell Lily what Darlene had told him. Not that day, not the next. He sat with it instead, the way he sat with most things that mattered, alone, turning them over, waiting for them to resolve into something he could act on or release. Lily spent her days hiking and sketching and reading on the porch of the station house, and in the evenings they ate together and talked about things that were easier. Her school, the friends she had, the college applications she was beginning to think about. She wanted to study environmental science or maybe history. She wasn't sure yet, and Marcus listened to her uncertainty with the particular admiration of a man watching someone younger than himself be more honest about what they didn't know than he had ever been. On the 5th day of her visit, she came back from an afternoon walk and said, "I went back to the tree." He looked up from the creek gauge readings he was entering into the log. "I looked for a while," she said. "The ground around the base is funny." "What do you mean, funny?" She sat down across from him. "The grass grows differently in a rough circle, maybe 8 feet out from the trunk. Shorter and denser than the surrounding grass. Like something is different under there." She paused. "And there's a depression on the north side. Not big, maybe 2 feet across, maybe 6 inches down. Old. Whatever made it, it's been there a long time." Marcus looked at her. "What are you thinking?" "I don't know." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm just saying the ground is funny." He went the next morning, earlier than he would have in normal circumstances, before the light was full, while mist was still sitting in the low ground near the creek. He had his pack with a folding shovel in it, which he told himself was a standard piece of trail equipment, which was true and also beside the point. The tree in early morning was different than in afternoon. The pale trunk caught what light there was and held it, almost luminous against the dark tree lean behind, and the crows were already there, 3 of them on the upper branches, watching him approach with the indifferent attention they gave everything. He stood at the base of the trunk and looked at the ground the way Lily had described. She was right. The grass around the base of the tree was shorter and denser in a rough oval, maybe 8 feet by 6, subtly distinct from the surrounding meadow grass in the way that vegetation sometimes grows differently over disturbed ground, over areas where the soil composition has been altered, over places where something is buried. The depression was on the north side, just as she had said, 2 feet across, roughly circular, its edges blurred by years of weathering and the slow erasure that time applies to all disturbances. Old, but not ancient. Marcus knelt beside it, pressing his hand to the soil. It gave slightly, more than the surrounding ground, with the faint springiness of earth that had at some point been worked and replaced. He unfolded the shovel. The soil came away easily in the first few inches, soft and dark, rich with the organic material that accumulates under grassland over time. Then harder, compacted, the kind of subsoil that tells you you're past the disturbed layer and into ground that has not been touched. He dug carefully, going slow, widening the hole rather than deepening it, the way he had been trained to approach anything that might be fragile or significant. 6 inches down. 8. At 10 inches his shovel struck something that was not stone. He stopped. The sound had been a dull knock, wood against metal, the particular resonance of a hollow object. He set the shovel aside and used his hands, brushing soil away with his fingers, working outward from the strike point, exposing the edge of something. A corner emerged first, right-angled, precise, the edge of something that had been made rather than grown. He brushed more soil away and found a flat surface, approximately horizontal, perhaps 18 inches across, and beside it another flat surface perpendicular, the depth of a box. He worked for 20 minutes with his hands alone before the shape was clear enough to identify with certainty. A wooden crate. Old, the wood darkened and hardened by decades in the soil, but intact, sealed with what appeared to be metal strapping around both the long edges, the kind of strapping used on shipping crates in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The lid was fitted, not hinged, set into a channel, and around its perimeter someone had applied what looked like pine pitch, pressed into the gap as a sealant. Someone had wanted this to stay closed. Marcus sat back on his heels and looked at the box for a long time, without touching it. He called the station house on his radio and got no answer, which he expected since he was alone and the radio was sitting on his kitchen counter. He called the Park Service emergency line and spoke to the duty officer, a man named Torres who was young and conscientious and who listened without interrupting while Marcus explained what he had found. "Don't open it," Torres said. "Protocol on any subsurface find is to document, photograph, and contact the Cultural Resources Office before proceeding. I know the protocol. I know you know it. I'm just saying it out loud." Marcus took photographs with his phone, careful and systematic, the crate in situ, the surrounding ground, the tree above, the rope cuts in the main limb visible in the background of several shots. He measured the depth of the box's top surface at 10 inches from the current ground level, noted the condition of the wood, noted the metal strapping, noted the pitch sealant around the lid. He did not open it. He went back to the station house and filed his documentation with the Cultural Resources Office that afternoon, and within 48 hours he had a call from a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, who ran the Regional Cultural Heritage Division and who asked him a series of careful questions about the location, the soil conditions, the apparent age of the crate, and whether he had any contextual information about the site. He told her about the tree. He told her what Darlene had told him. He told her about Elias Cutter. There was a pause on the line. Then, "How certain is the local historical record?" "Not very certain," Marcus said. "Oral tradition. A couple of generations of it. But Darlene Vasquez's family has been in the valley since the 1880s, and she's specific about names and dates." "I'll come out Friday," Dr. Osei said. "Don't touch anything until then." He picked Lily up from the trailhead that evening. She had been out all day, and her boots were muddy, and she was carrying 2 pages of new sketches, the cottonwood tree rendered from several angles, the rope cuts in detail. She handed them to him in the truck without comment, and he held them in his hands and looked at them while she drove, because she had taken over driving his truck on rural roads when she was 15, and he had let her on the grounds that it was good experience and the roads were quiet. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, you found something." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know? You got that particular face." He considered how to respond to this. "I found a crate, buried under the base of the tree. I filed with Cultural Resources. Someone is coming Friday." Lily did not take her eyes off the road. "How old?" "Old enough. I don't know yet." She nodded once, slowly. "Okay," she said. "Good. Dr. Patricia Osei arrived Friday morning in a truck with university plates and two graduate students who carried cases of equipment and said nothing that wasn't procedural. She was a compact, organized woman in her 50s who wore her hair short and her authority lightly, and who walked to the Cottonwood with the directness of someone who had spent her career going toward things other people went around. She examined the crate in the ground for 20 minutes before she said anything of substance. Then she looked at Marcus and said, "The pitch sealant and the strapping style are consistent with late 19th century. The wood is white oak, which was common in crating of that period in this region." She paused. Whoever buried this was trying to preserve what was inside. She looked at the tree, at the rope cuts in the main limb, at the ground around the base. "Deliberate placement," she said. "This wasn't random concealment. This was burial. Someone chose this spot for a reason." Marcus said nothing. He was watching her the way he watched the landscape when he was tracking something, with the whole of his attention. Dr. Osei brought out a camera of her own and began her documentation, more thorough than his had been, recording at multiple focal lengths, taking soil samples from the surrounding area, measuring the dimensions of the depression and the crate itself with the precision of someone to whom precision was the work rather than the precaution. It was her graduate student, a young man named Danforth, who lifted the crate free with careful hands 2 hours later, after the excavation had been extended and the surrounding soil had been catalogued. The crate was roughly the size of a small toolbox, maybe 20 inches long and 10 wide and 8 deep, heavier than it looked. The pine pitch sealant had held remarkably well. The lid was fitted tight. They carried it to a portable table the students had set up at the edge of the clearing, in the shade of the tree-line, away from the cottonwood. Dr. Osei worked the lid with a small pry tool, going gently, working the edge gradually around the perimeter, and the pitch gave way in pieces, dry and crumbly after all the years in the soil, and then the lid shifted and came free. Marcus was standing far enough back that he could not see inside the crate until Dr. Osei lifted a layer of what turned out to be oilcloth, multiple layers of it, folded carefully over whatever was underneath, the kind of wrapping that preserved the newspapers of that era for decades in attics and cedar chests. She set the oilcloth aside, looked into the crate, was quiet for long enough that the graduate students exchanged a glance. "Mr. Cole," she said, "come here." He stepped forward and looked into the crate. Inside, wrapped individually in more oilcloth, were papers, documents, folded and bound with string, a stack of them, and beside the stack a smaller bundle that had the shape and approximate size of a book. Beneath everything, pressed against the bottom of the crate, was a cloth pouch tied closed with a leather cord, and from the way it lay flat against the wood, the way it conformed to the crate's base, it contained something thin and flexible rather than rigid. Dr. Osei lifted the bound stack first. She examined the string, which was deteriorated but intact, and set it aside without opening it. Then the book-shaped bundle. Then the cloth pouch, which she turned in her hands with particular care, feeling its contents through the fabric. She looked at Marcus. Her expression was composed in the way professional expressions are when something unexpected has been encountered and the professional has not yet decided how to characterize it. "Do you want to know what we're looking at before I've done any analysis?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Preliminary assessment only." She set the pouch down gently. The documents appear to be legal papers of some kind, possibly deeds or conveyances. The bound volume may be a ledger or journal. The pouch, she paused. The pouch contains photographs. Glass plate photographs, by the feel of it, which would be consistent with the period. She looked at him. Whoever buried this was preserving evidence. Marcus thought about Clara Cutter, 19 years old in 1897, with a baby son and letters that went nowhere and a contested land claim that the court had dismissed without real examination. He thought about someone digging in the dark under a tree that was still being used for executions, burying something for safekeeping in the place that had taken everything from her. Because who would look here, who would dig under this particular ground, who would come back for what was hidden at the foot of a hanging tree? He said to Dr. Osei, "I need to tell you something about this site." She looked at him. He told her everything. Elias Cutter, Harlan Price, the contested land, the trial that lasted 2 days, the attorney who was a drinker, the 2 witnesses who worked for the man who wanted the land, Clara's complaints that went nowhere, Clara going north with a baby named Samuel and never coming back. Dr. Osei listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then looked down at the crate, at the documents inside it. If this is what I think it may be, she said, it changes things considerably. What do you think it may be? Evidence of a wrongful conviction. Documentation of a land theft. She paused. Possibly more. She looked up at him. We need to do this properly. Full conservation analysis. Historical records search. I'm going to need you to give me time. How much time? She looked at the crate, at the oilcloth bundles, at the pouch. Weeks. Maybe months, if the documents require restoration. Marcus looked at the tree, at the pale trunk, at the crows still sitting in their rows on the upper branches. He thought about 11 years of walking past. Take what you need, he said. Dr. Osei and her students worked the site for 3 full days. They removed the crate to the University Conservation Lab 2 days after its opening, taking it in a climate-controlled case with the kind of care that told Marcus they understood what they had. She left him with a business card and a satellite phone number and told him she would be in contact. Lily left for home 4 days later, at the end of her visit. She hugged him at the truck, held on longer than usual, and then stepped back and looked at him with her mother's directness and said, "Don't let this go." He was quiet. "I mean it," she said. "Don't do the thing where you file a report and check a box and consider your obligation met. This is someone's family." He looked at her. She was 17 years old, and she was right. "I know," he said. She got in the car she had borrowed from a friend in town, the friend who was driving her to the bus station 60 miles away, and Marcus stood in the parking area of the station house and watched the dust of her departure settle back down onto the gravel road. And then he went inside and started making phone calls. He started with Darlene Vasquez, who listened to what he told her about the crate and the documents and Dr. Osei's preliminary assessment with the focused attention of someone receiving news they have been waiting for a long time. "Samuel Cutter," Darlene said when he finished. "Clara's son. She went north, like I said, probably Oregon or Washington. Samuel would have been born around 1896 or 1897, right around the time of the hanging. If he lived an ordinary life, he'd be dead by now, obviously, but there could be children, grandchildren. How would we find them?" Darlene was quiet for a moment. "Start with death records," she said. "Oregon and Washington State Archives, if he stayed northwest. Veterans' records if he served, which most men of his generation did. Work backward from there." She paused. "My grandmother kept a correspondence with Clara for a few years after she left. Letters came from a town in Oregon," she said. "Somewhere up the coast. I'd have to look for the letters. Do you have them?" "I have most of what my grandmother left. It's in a cedar trunk in my back room. Give me a few days." It took Darlene not a few days but 8, which was still faster than Marcus had expected, and she called him on a Tuesday morning with a name and a town in the letters. Clara Cutter, writing to Darlene's grandmother in 1901, 1902, and 1904, from a town called Morro Bay on the Oregon coast. By 1904 the letters stopped. No explanation in the ones that remained. Marcus filed the name and town with Dr. Osei, who had a research assistant working on genealogical records. He also filed with the County Historical Society, with the state archives, and with a nonprofit organization called the Western Innocence History Project that he found through a web search at 2 in the morning on a sleepless Thursday, sitting at his kitchen table with the creek gauge readings untouched beside him. The Western Innocence History Project called him back within a week. A woman named Renata Cruz, who had the focused, unhurried manner of someone who did this work because it required patience, and she had been patient her whole life. She asked him careful questions, took detailed notes, and told him that wrongful conviction cases with land dispossession elements from the 1890s were not uncommon in the West, and that there was a legal and historical framework for pursuing them, not in terms of criminal exoneration. The courts didn't work that way for the long dead, but in terms of historical record correction and, in some cases, land claims. Land claims, Marcus said. If the original title transfer can be shown to have been fraudulently obtained, she said, and if there are living descendants who can establish lineage, there are legal instruments available, not straightforward, not fast, but available. Marcus thought about Clara going north with a baby. He thought about 40 acres of good land with water rights, timber, and pasture, taken by a man who owed favors from a man whose attorney spent the second day of the trial visibly impaired. He thought about the crate in the ground, the layers of oilcloth, the pine pitch seal, someone preserving something carefully against time. Dr. Osei called on a Friday, 6 weeks after she had taken the crate. She had a steady voice that became quieter when the information was significant, and it was quiet now. The documents, she said. We've completed preliminary conservation and analysis. He was outside on the station house porch. The valley spread below him in the afternoon light, the high country above in the last of the summer haze. The legal papers, she continued, are deeds. 2 original land deeds for the Cutter property, the 40 acres. One is the original patent deed, issued to Elias Cutter in 1886. The other is a deed of trust, drawn up in September 1897. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. 1 month before the hanging, in which Elias Cutter placed his land in trust for his daughter Clara and her child, specifically to protect it from seizure in the event of any legal judgment against him. Marcus sat down on the porch steps. The deed of trust was properly drawn and witnessed, Dr. Osei said. If it had been presented at the probate proceedings, it would have made the land transfer to Price legally impossible. Clara's rights to the land would have been unchallengeable. She was quiet for a moment. The deed was never presented. It was here, in the ground. Marcus said, "The journal." "The journal," she said, and her voice went quieter still. "It's a record kept by the clerk of the 1897 trial, a man named Henry Dobbs. He was the court clerk for Harlan County from 1891 to 1908. She paused. He kept a private record separate from the official transcript. The private record notes that 2 of the prosecution witnesses visited the sheriff's office twice each in the week before they were scheduled to testify. That Harlan Price's land agent, a man named Asa Webb, attended both days of the trial. That the rifle presented as evidence was logged into the sheriff's evidence store 3 days after Cutter's arrest, with a notation that it had been found on Cutter's property, but the date of the notation does not match the date on the original intake form, which shows the rifle was logged 4 days before Cutter was arrested. She let that land. The rifle was in custody before Cutter was arrested, Marcus said, before they'd even found it on his property, before they'd even claimed to find it. Yes, the intake date discrepancy is documentary evidence of evidence fabrication. Dobbs noted it in his private journal. He also noted that he brought it to the judge's attention before sentencing and was told that clerical errors were a matter for the clerk and not the bench. Marcus was looking at the valley below him, at the long afternoon shadow of the ridge moving east across the grass. The creek was audible from the porch if you were quiet. He had listened to it for 11 years. "You said there were photographs," he said. "Glass plate photographs," she said. 12 of them. Significant deterioration, but 10 are legible. They appear to be surveillance photographs, if you can call it that. Candid images taken without the subject's knowledge. They show a series of meetings between a man identified in Dobbs's journal as Asa Webb and one of the 2 prosecution witnesses, taken at least 6 weeks before Sims was killed. The photographs show documents being exchanged between Webb and the witness. In one photograph, currency is clearly visible. The photographs were taken by Dobbs. Almost certainly, he had access to photographic equipment through his position. The county used photography for legal documentation by the 1890s. He was building a record. He documented the conspiracy against Cutter, and then, for whatever reason, he never came forward with it. Why? She was quiet. "I don't know." Fear, probably. Price was a powerful man. Or guilt, the particular kind that comes when you know you watched something happen and didn't stop it. He put everything in a crate and he sealed it, and he buried it somewhere it would be found eventually. Under the tree. She paused. That was a choice, burying it there. Yes, Marcus said. It was. He sat on the porch for a long time after the call ended, the phone in his hand, looking at the valley. A clerk named Henry Dobbs, who had watched a man hanged for a crime fabricated against him by a man who wanted his land, who had documented the whole thing carefully and precisely, and who had not been able to bring himself to speak, but had not been able to bring himself to destroy what he knew either, who had found the only middle path available to him, which was to preserve the evidence and bury it where someone might someday find it, under the hanging tree, in the place that already held the weight of what had been done, where anyone who came looking for truth would eventually have reason to look. Marcus thought about the clerk's logic, the particular desperation of it. He thought about the oilcloth wrapping, layer after layer, and the pine pitch seal, and the crate itself, white oak, well-made, chosen for its durability. Someone who intended this to survive. Someone who had sat in a courtroom and watched justice fail and had then gone home and built a container for the evidence of that failure and buried it where the act had happened, under the very tree, and had spent the rest of his life, presumably, in the ordinary silence of a man who knows what he knows and can't say it. He thought about Lily, sitting at the base of the trunk in July morning with her notebook, looking up at rope cuts in old bark. About how she had come back a second time and found the depression in the ground and the different quality of the grass around the base, and had come home and told him without fanfare, without drama, just, the ground is funny. And about how if she had not come, if he had not spent 11 years walking past, and then one morning sat in the grass with his daughter and finally looked, the crate would still be in the ground. He called Lily that night. She answered on the second ring. Dad. He told her about the deed of trust. He told her about the journal and the photographs and the intake date on the rifle. He told her about Henry Dobbs and the oilcloth and the pine pitch and the particular choice of location. He talked for a long time without stopping, which was unusual for him, and Lily listened without interrupting, which was usual for her. When he finished, there was a pause. So Elias Cutter was innocent, she said, by every available measure. Yes, and Clara knew. She knew everything, had the deed of trust, and still couldn't stop them from taking the land. We don't know what Clara knew, Marcus said. The crate was sealed before the trial ended, or shortly after. She may not have known about the journal or the photographs. The deed of trust she probably knew about, but she may not have known where it was or who had it. Another pause. Do you think she looked for it? He thought about a 19-year-old woman with a baby, filing complaints, writing letters, losing in court. He thought about going north into a silence that swallowed her. I think she tried everything she could try, and then had to stop and take care of her child. Yeah, Lily said softly. She would have had to stop. They were quiet for a moment. Renata Cruz at the Innocence History Project thinks there may be descendants, Marcus said. Clara took the baby north, probably Oregon coast. We have a town name from letters she wrote in the early 1900s. Morro Bay? Are you going to look? I'm going to look. Good, Lily said, and Marcus could hear in her voice the same quality it had when she sat under the tree with her notebook, the quality of someone who had already decided something and was waiting for the relevant adult to catch up. He started looking the following morning. The search for Samuel Cutter, born probably 1896 or 1897 to Clara Cutter, née Halverson, and Elias Cutter, deceased October 1897, Harlan County, was the kind of search that required patience applied with precision, which was a different skill from the patience required by patrol work, but not entirely unrelated. Marcus requested the Oregon State Archives vital records for Morro Bay and surrounding counties, which took 10 days to arrive. He searched the federal census records available online for 1900, 1910, and 1920, looking for a Clara Cutter or Clara Halverson or some variant, a woman with a son around the right age, on the Oregon coast. The 1900 census was unhelpful. Morro Bay was a small coastal community and the records were incomplete, common for the period. The 1910 census showed a Clara Halverson, age 32, occupation housekeeper, living in a boarding house in a coastal town 15 miles north of Morro Bay. With her was a boy listed as Samuel Halverson, age 13. She had reverted to her maiden name, or possibly the enumerator had recorded it incorrectly, which was also common. Samuel Halverson, not Cutter. The name change was either Clara's deliberate choice or an enumerator's error, but it was the right age, the right location, the right given name. Marcus sent the finding to Renata Cruz and to Dr. Osei, and to his daughter, who called him that same evening. She changed his name, Lily said, or the enumerator got it wrong. No, she changed it. She didn't want him carrying his father's name in a new place. She wanted him to be someone without a history that could follow him. Lily paused. That's so sad. Marcus thought about it. Yeah, it is. But she kept her own maiden name instead of just disappearing into something else entirely. She still wanted to be herself. He had not thought about it that way. He sat with it. That means Samuel Halverson is the thread, Lily said. Not Samuel Cutter. You're looking for Halverson descendants. He found Samuel Halverson in the 1920 census, age 23, living in a coastal town in northern Oregon, occupation fisherman. In the 1930 census, age 33, same town, occupation unchanged, married to a woman named Ruth, one child listed, a daughter, Eleanor. Clara was not in the 1930 census, which suggested she had died sometime in the 1920s, which fit with the letters to Darlene's grandmother stopping in 1904. She might have survived until the 1920s in relative obscurity, or she might have died earlier, and the census enumerator had simply not recorded her passing accurately. Eleanor Halverson, born approximately 1927, father Samuel, mother Ruth. A daughter rather than a son, which meant the name would probably change again with marriage, which meant the genealogical thread would require another bend. Marcus filed with the Oregon Vital Records Office for marriage records for Eleanor Halverson in the period 1945 to 1965, which seemed like a reasonable window. He was patient. He was good at this kind of sustained attention. He had been trained to track things over large terrain and long time periods. And this was the same skill applied to paper rather than land. The marriage record arrived 3 weeks later. Eleanor Halverson married in 1951 a man named Thomas Reed. The record was from a coastal county in Oregon. There was an address. He stared at the address for a long time. Then he called Dr. Osei. I have a probable descendant, he said. At least one generation back from living people, possibly 2 or 3. Dr. Osei was quiet for a moment. Do you know how to proceed from here? I know how to proceed, he said, but I want your guidance on what the documentation supports before I contact anyone. He wanted to be certain before he walked into someone's life with a 127-year-old story about a dead man, and a hanging tree and a crate full of evidence that had been waiting in the ground for someone to come looking. He wanted to know exactly what he had before he put it in front of someone and asked them to carry the weight of it. Dr. Osei talked him through the documentation carefully. The deed of trust was legally coherent and original, she said. The journal was consistent with other documentary evidence from the period, and the photographs corroborated the testimony Dobbs had recorded. The intake date discrepancy on the rifle was the kind of evidence that would have been compelling in court in 1897 and was no less compelling now as historical record. The picture it assembled, she said, was this. Elias Cutter had been framed for a murder committed or arranged by or on behalf of Harlan Price in order to obtain his land. The clerk of the court had documented this conspiracy in a private record and had buried that record along with the deed of trust that would have protected Clara and Samuel's rights to the property. The land had been fraudulently transferred, and the fraud had been buried along with the evidence. And what does that mean now? Marcus asked. Officially, it means a petition to the state historical record to amend the record of Elias Cutter's conviction, which is a slow and bureaucratic process but achievable given the evidence. Legally, it means that if descendants can be identified and choose to pursue a land claim, the fraudulent nature of the original transfer is documentable, which gives a legal basis for challenge. He was quiet. It will not be simple, she said. The land has changed hands multiple times. There are current holders who have good faith claims. It is not a case of someone getting the 40 acres back, but there are remedies, historical remedies. And there is, at minimum, the restoration of a man's name. A man's name, Elias Cutter, she said, who was hanged under that tree for something he didn't do, whose daughter had to change her son's name and go away and never come back. There's something to be said for getting his name right. Marcus looked at the address from the 1951 marriage record, written in his own handwriting on a notepad on the kitchen table. Eleanor Halverson married Thomas Reed. A coastal county in Oregon 50 years ago. The Reeds could be anywhere by now or nowhere. There could be children or grandchildren. There might be no one left who knew the name Cutter at all. He thought about Clara, writing letters in the early 1900s to a woman in a valley she had left forever, and the letters stopping, and nothing after that but the silence that swallows people who have no one left to speak for them. Someone was going to speak now. He booked 2 days off and drove north to Oregon. The coast road north of the California border was the kind of road that reminded you the continent had an edge. The Pacific appeared and disappeared behind headlands as Marcus drove, steel gray in the October morning, moving with the slow authority of something that had been there long before anyone built roads along its margin and would be there long after the roads washed back into it. He had grown up in a landlocked county, and the ocean still affected him the way it affected most people who came to it late, with a combination of humility and unease that had no inland equivalent. He had the 1951 marriage record in a folder on the passenger seat. Eleanor Halverson married Thomas Reed, coastal Oregon. The county recorder's office had been the starting point, and from there the thread had continued with the particular momentum that archival research sometimes built, one record pointing to another, each document a door into the next room. The Reeds had stayed on the coast. A Thomas Reed appeared in the county tax records through 1979, the same parcel updated and transferred, and in the obituary database Marcus had accessed through the public library system. Thomas Reed had died in 1981, survived by his wife Eleanor and 3 children, names listed: Douglas, Patricia, and James. Eleanor Reed née Halverson had died in 2003. Her obituary, which Marcus had found through the same database after 2 hours of patient searching, listed her as a retired schoolteacher, a gardener, a member of the coastal Lutheran congregation, a woman who had loved birds and kept meticulous records of every species she observed at the feeder outside her kitchen window for 40 years. The obituary did not mention her mother Ruth, or her father Samuel, or her grandmother Clara. It did not mention the name Cutter. It did not mention a valley 400 miles to the south where a man had been hanged under a cottonwood tree in October 1897, and where a deed and a journal and a set of glass plate photographs had waited in the ground for 127 years. It listed Douglas Reed of Newport, Oregon, as the eldest surviving child. Marcus had called the Newport phone directory the night before driving north. There was one Douglas Reed listed. He had called the number and gotten a voicemail, a man's voice, unhurried and mildly cautious. The voice of someone in his 60s or 70s who had learned that unexpected phone calls were usually not good news. Marcus had left a message that he hoped struck the right balance between honest and measured. He said his name. He said he was a park ranger in Northern California. He said he had come across some historical information relating to the Halverson family and would appreciate the chance to speak in person. He said he would be in the Newport area the following day and would welcome a meeting at a time and place of Mr. Reed's convenience. He had not mentioned Elias Cutter. He had not mentioned a hanging tree. Some information required a room and a face and the ability to read what was happening to the person in front of you, and a voicemail was none of those things. Douglas Reed had called back at 7 in the morning. His voice on the phone was the same as on the voicemail, careful, slightly wary, the voice of a man who had some experience with things not being what they first appeared to be. He asked Marcus to clarify what kind of historical information. Marcus said, "Information about your grandmother's family, specifically her father's family, going back to the 1890s. I'd prefer to show you the documentation in person. It's significant, and I want to do it right." There was a pause that Marcus read as the particular hesitation of someone deciding whether this was a scam or a genuine thing, and what the relative costs of each possibility looked like. "There's a diner in town," Douglas Reed said finally. "Harbor Street, you'll see it. I'll be there at 11. He was already at a corner table when Marcus arrived, a man in his late 60s with a broad, weathered face and the hands of someone who had worked outdoors for a long time, large-knuckled, capable-looking. He was drinking coffee and reading a newspaper that he folded and set aside when Marcus came in, with the gesture of a man clearing the table for what was coming. He looked at Marcus with the evaluating attention of someone deciding whether to trust before the word started. "Marcus Cole," Marcus said, extending his hand. "I appreciate you meeting me. Douglas Reed." He shook it, firm and brief. "Sit down." They ordered coffee. Marcus set his folder on the table, but did not open it yet. He had thought about how to begin this and had decided on the long way around, the way that built the foundation before the roof, because what was in the folder required a foundation or it would feel like an assault. He started with the tree. He described the cottonwood the way he would describe any feature of his district, with the precision and restraint of a man who had learned to let the land speak for itself, and watched Douglas Reed's face while he did it. The face was neutral in the way that faces are neutral when they're working, when the person behind them is doing something effortful with what they're receiving. He described Lily noticing the different quality of the grass, the depression in the soil, the sound his shovel made at 10 inches. Douglas Reed set down his coffee cup. Marcus opened the folder. He had printed photographs from Dr. Osei's documentation, good clean photographs, the crate in situ, the lid coming free, the oilcloth bundles inside. He laid them on the table in the order in which things had happened, not rushing, giving each one time. Then he explained what the documents were. The deed of trust, the journal, the photographs. He explained what Henry Dobbs had recorded in his private journal, about the witnesses and the rifle and the intake date that didn't match, and the land agent Asa Webb sitting in the courtroom watching a man be convicted for something that Dobbs had documented evidence was arranged rather than committed. He explained about Harlan Price and the 40 acres and the trial that lasted 2 days with an attorney who spent the second day impaired. He explained about Clara, who had written letters to a woman in the valley for a few years and then gone silent, and whose letters had survived in a cedar trunk in a back room for 120 years. Douglas Reed was very still during this. He had the stillness of someone who had encountered something much heavier than expected and was making no sudden movements until he understood where the weight was distributed. When Marcus finished, the diner's sounds continued around them, the ordinary noise of people eating breakfast on an ordinary morning. It felt strange, that ordinariness. Douglas Reed said, "My mother never talked about any of this." "She may not have known," Marcus said. "If Clara changed Samuel's name when she left, and if Samuel kept that change for his whole life, it's possible none of what happened in that valley ever got passed down. People protected their children from the past that way. My mother's maiden name was Halverson. Yes. Not Cutter. Not Cutter. No." Douglas looked at the photographs on the table. He picked up the one showing the inside of the crate, the oilcloth bundles, the cloth pouch. Held it in his hands without speaking. "My grandmother," he said. "Eleanor. She used to say her mother Ruth never spoke about Ruth's husband's family. Said Samuel was a quiet man who didn't look backward. She said her mother thought there had been something painful in his history, but that he'd made a decision not to carry it, and that she respected that decision." Douglas paused. "I always thought it meant maybe a bad marriage in Samuel's past, or a family estrangement. Something ordinary." He set the photograph down. "Nothing like this." Marcus waited. Douglas looked at him. "Elias Cutter was my great-great-grandfather. By our best reconstruction, yes. And he was hanged for something he didn't do, so that a man could take his land. Yes." Douglas Reed looked out the diner window at the street. October light on the harbor, boats at the dock, the particular gray-blue of a coastal morning. His hands were flat on the table, very still. "My grandmother kept a journal her whole life," he said. 40-some volumes. I have them. After she died, I brought them home because nobody else was going to, and I couldn't let them go to a landfill. I've read most of them." He paused. "In the very first one, which she started in 1945 when she was about 18, there's an entry where she writes about asking her father where his family came from. She wrote that he told her his father had been a man who was treated badly by people with more power than integrity, and that he had learned from this that some histories were better set down than carried, and that he was setting it down. She wrote that she never asked again, that she understood from his voice that the question had cost him something to answer." Marcus looked at his hands. "Set down rather than carried." A man who had grown up knowing only that his grandfather had been taken from his mother and that the taking had been wrong, who had decided the only survivable response was to put it on the ground and walk away from it, change his name, give his daughter a different inheritance, let the wound close without passing it forward. He thought about Clara, who had gone north and named her son after his murdered father and then changed that name too, understanding perhaps that survival required the particular act of amputation that grief sometimes demanded. "It cost her," Marcus said quietly. Douglas looked at him. "Clara. Changing his name. She couldn't keep everything. She kept herself. She kept Halverson, but she gave up Cutter to protect him. That had to cost her. Douglas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What do we do with this?" Marcus told him about Renata Cruz and the Western Innocence History Project, about the petition to amend the historical record of Elias Cutter's conviction, about the possibility of a land claim, complicated and slow but documentable, about Dr. Osei's conservation work and the plan to deposit the documentation with the State Historical Archive, where it would become part of the permanent record. "This isn't about money," Douglas said. "Not primarily. Not for me." Marcus nodded. "His name," Douglas said. "What you said before, about restoring his name. That's what I want to understand more about. What does that actually mean? What does it look like?" "It means the State Historical Record notes that the conviction of Elias Cutter in 1897 was achieved through fabricated evidence and suborned testimony in service of a land theft, and that the historical record should be amended accordingly. It means Elias Cutter's name is no longer on a list of people convicted of murder. It means anyone who looks for that name in those records finds something that tells the truth." Douglas Reed looked at the photographs on the table for a long time. "My sister Patricia should be part of this," he said. "And my brother James. This belongs to all of us. Of course. I'll call them today." His voice had changed from what it was at the beginning of the conversation, the wariness gone, replaced by something that was not quite certainty, but was moving toward it. The particular quality of someone who has been handed an unexpected responsibility and is already working out how to carry it properly. Marcus drove back south that evening with the folder on the passenger seat and a feeling in his chest that he did not immediately have a word for. It was not satisfaction, though it was adjacent to it. It was closer to the feeling of finding the right grade on a slope that you had been uncertain about, the particular rightness of angle that makes a thing work the way it was supposed to. He had set something in motion that had been waiting a very long time to move. He called Lily from a rest stop somewhere in the Coast Range. She answered immediately. How did it go? He told her about Douglas Reed, about the diner, about the journal entry Eleanor Halverson had made in 1945 about her father's one answer to her one question. He told her what Douglas had said about names. Set down rather than carried, Lily said when he got to that part. His words, yes. Samuel's, passed down through his daughter. Lily was quiet for a moment. That's so much to ask of a person. I know. To just set it down. Like it wasn't still happening. Like the land wasn't still gone and his grandfather wasn't still buried under the tree that killed him and his name wasn't still wrong in the official record. Yeah. She was quiet again, and Marcus drove through the range with the phone on speaker on the passenger seat and the trees close on both sides of the road, dark in the fading evening light. But he did it, she said finally. For his daughter. He set it down so she could walk forward without it. He did. We're picking it back up for him, she said. Yes, we are. Another silence. Then good. She sounded the same as when she had said it before, when he had found the crate, when he had decided to look for descendants. The same quality of someone who has been waiting for the right answer and is relieved when it finally comes. He got home after midnight and slept for 6 hours and woke to a voicemail from Renata Cruz, who had been following the developments through his regular reports and who wanted to discuss the next phase. The next phase involved paperwork in quantities that surprised Marcus, though it probably shouldn't have. The petition to amend the historical conviction record required documentation of the original trial, documentation of the discovered evidence, a formal statement from Dr. Osei's conservation analysis, supporting historical context from the regional archive, and a narrative affidavit from Marcus himself as the person who had found the crate. Renata Cruz guided him through it with the patience of someone who had done this before and understood that the people doing it for the first time needed patience more than they needed speed. It also required the participation of the Cutter descendants, which Douglas had said he would secure and did, efficiently, within a week. He drove to Portland to meet his sister Patricia and flew his brother James up from Sacramento, and the three of them called Marcus on a Saturday morning in a three-way conference that was one of the more unusual conversations of his life, 3 people in their 60s and 70s sitting in a living room in Portland absorbing the reconstructed history of their family's obliteration and deciding how to respond to it. Patricia Reed was a retired judge, which Marcus had not anticipated, and which gave her a particular clarity about the legal dimensions of what they were dealing with. She asked precise questions about the evidence chain, about the chain of custody for the documents since their discovery, about the standards the petition process would use to evaluate the material. She was not skeptical in the sense of being obstructive, but in the sense of being thorough, which Marcus appreciated. James Reed was a contractor who built custom homes in the Sacramento area, and who said less than his siblings, but listened with concentrated attention, and who said at the end of the call, "My grandmother would have wanted this. Not the land, though that would have been something. But the name. She would have wanted the name right." "How do you know?" Patricia asked him. "Because she planted an apple tree in her backyard in 1957, James said, and she named it after her mother. She called it Ruth's tree. Not her husband's family's name. Her mother's. She knew she came from somewhere, and she honored it even without knowing exactly where." He paused. Someone who does that cares about names. Marcus thought about Eleanor Halverson watching birds from her kitchen window for 40 years and recording every species in her meticulous records. A woman who paid precise attention to what came and went, who kept track of things, who understood that the act of recording was itself a form of care. He thought about Henry Dobbs, the clerk, building his private record with the same understanding. He thought about Lily and her notebooks. There was something in it, the impulse to document, to bear witness, to set down what was true even when the truth couldn't be acted on immediately, to trust that the act of recording was not nothing, that it had its own form of consequence across time. The petition process took 4 months. Marcus filed the formal paperwork in November, and the State Historical Review Board acknowledged receipt in December and scheduled a preliminary hearing for February. Renata Cruz told him 4 months was actually fast for this kind of proceeding, which was information he received without comment, because what she meant was that it was fast relative to cases that had taken years or decades, and fast relative to a century and a quarter of a man's name being wrong in the official record was a frame of reference he found difficult to apply. He told Dr. O say this, and she laughed, which was the first time she had laughed in his presence, and said, "The arc of history is long, Mr. Cole. This is still part of the arc." He spent the winter doing his regular work, which continued to require exactly what it had always required, patience applied with precision across large terrain and long time periods. He counted elk from a ridge above the high country in November and came down with an accurate tally and a photograph of a bull that Lily told him, when he sent it to her, was the best photograph he had ever taken. He monitored the creek gauges through December storms and reported the data accurately and responded to 3 separate calls about illegal camping in the upper drainage and handled them with the matter-of-fact courtesy that was his natural mode. He went back to the hanging tree in December, on a day when the ground was frozen and the cottonwood was stark against a white sky and the crows were absent for once. He stood at the base and looked at the excavation site, now filled and tamped. The earth settled back into itself, the depression gone. The grass around the base still had its slightly different quality, shorter and denser, and it would probably always have that quality because the soil beneath it had been altered and the alteration didn't entirely reverse. He stood there for a while. Not praying, not exactly. Something like acknowledgement. Something like saying I see you to a place that had been a witness to something for a very long time. He thought about Elias Cutter at 42, a man who had built fences himself and buried his dog on 40 acres of good land and refused to sell it to someone who didn't work his own cattle. A man who had understood that certain things were worth refusing regardless of what was offered in exchange, and who had been killed for that understanding. He thought about what it meant to be hanged for your integrity by men who had none, and whether that kind of death meant you lost or whether it was possible to maintain that you hadn't. He thought it was possible. He thought the crate in the ground was evidence of it, not just in the evidentiary sense, but in the moral sense. Elias Cutter had been refused justice in life, and the earth had held the proof of that refusal for 127 years, waiting, and eventually someone had come to look. Eventually justice had found its way through the ground, if not through the court. He walked back down the trail and did his afternoon rounds and filed his evening report and called his daughter. She answered on the first ring. "Hey, Dad. How's school?" "Good. Midterms are okay." She paused. "Did you go to the tree?" He smiled. "How do you know? You sound like you've been thinking about something heavy for a while, and then set it down." He thought about Samuel. Set down rather than carried. "Yeah," he said. "I went." Lily was quiet for a moment. "I've been looking at environmental history programs. There's one at the University of Oregon that focuses on land use and historical ecology." She paused. looking at how land was used and taken and changed. Understanding what the land remembers. What the land remembers. My professor used that phrase. She used it to mean the physical record, the soil composition, the hydrological patterns, the way vegetation grows differently over disturbed ground. But I think it means more than that. I think places hold the things that happened in them in ways that go beyond what we can measure. Marcus thought about the grass around the base of the cottonwood, shorter and denser in a rough oval, growing differently for reasons that were explicable and also felt like something more than explanation. I think that's right, he said. The February hearing was conducted by a 3-person panel of the State Historical Review Board, 2 historians and an attorney, and Marcus presented his portion of the testimony in a conference room in Salem with Douglas and Patricia and James Reed in seats behind him and Renata Cruz beside him and Dr. Osei appearing by video link from the university. Dr. Osei presented the conservation analysis. The documents were authentic to the period, she said, the materials and methods consistent with 1890s production, and the content cohered with other documentary evidence from Harlan County of the same period that she had cross-referenced. The private journal of Henry Dobbs, she said, was a remarkable document, the work of a man who understood that he was recording something that could not be spoken aloud in his time, but that needed to exist in the permanent record. Renata Cruz presented the legal analysis. The fabrication of evidence, she said, was documentable from the intake date discrepancy alone, even without the photographs and the journal. The photographs and the journal corroborated a conspiracy that, had it been known at the time, would have precluded the conviction. The land transfer that followed the conviction was, in her assessment, fraudulent on its face and fraudulent in its execution. Marcus testified about finding the crate. He was brief and exact, the way he was brief and exact in his field reports, because the facts were sufficient and sufficient facts did not need embellishment. Patricia Reed testified about her family. She was measured and precise, as he would have expected from a retired judge, but at one point her voice changed, just slightly, when she described what her grandmother Eleanor had written in her first journal in 1945 about asking her father where his family came from. She read the passage directly from a photocopy of the journal page, which Douglas had provided. She read it clearly, and then paused, and the pause said everything that needed to be said about what it meant to be a woman of 80-some years trying to honor her father's decision to set something down, while also standing in a room to say that what had been set down had never stopped being true. The panel deliberated for 6 weeks. The determination arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday in April, addressed to Marcus at the station house, because he was the record filer, and he stood at the mailbox at the end of the station house driveway and held the envelope for a moment before opening it. He opened it. The language was formal and careful in the way legal language is formal and careful, acknowledging the limitations of historical determination, noting the standard of evidence required, noting the relevant statutes and procedures. He read through the formal language to the substance. The board found that the conviction of Elias Cutter in the matter of the death of Burl Sims, Harlan County, 1897, was achieved through the fabrication of physical evidence and the procurement of false testimony, and that the evidence of this fabrication, preserved in the private journal of court clerk Henry Dobbs and corroborated by photographic documentation, met the board's evidentiary standard for historical record amendment. The conviction of Elias Cutter was to be noted in the state historical record as a wrongful conviction achieved by fraud in the context of a land dispossession scheme. He read it twice. Then he sat down on the front steps of the station house with the letter in his hands and looked at the valley below him in the April morning and felt the particular weight of a thing that has been wrong for a very long time becoming right. He called Douglas Reed. Douglas answered quickly, as though he had been near the phone. Marcus read him the determination. When he finished, there was silence, and then Douglas said, "Okay." His voice was not exactly happy. It was something past the point where happy was the right word, something that recognized the inadequacy of any word for what happens when a wrong is finally named correctly after 127 years. "I'm going to tell my sister," Douglas said. "And James," Marcus said. "Tell them that Elias Cutter's name will be correct in the record from now on. Tell them that anyone who looks will find the truth." Douglas was quiet for a moment. "He planted his own fences," Marcus said. "That's what Darlene Vasquez told me. He refused to sell because he built the fences himself and buried his dog on that land. He understood that some things are worth refusing. He paused. He died refusing. But he was right to refuse. Douglas's voice, when it came, was careful. My kids are going to know this story. Good. It's a story worth knowing. He called Lily next. She was in class and didn't answer, and he left a voicemail that was longer than his voicemails usually were, reading her the key line of the determination, telling her what Douglas had said, and ending with something he hadn't planned to say, but that came out anyway, which was that none of this would have happened without her sitting down in the grass under a cottonwood tree with her notebook and noticing that the ground was funny. She called him back at lunch. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, you did this. You made me look." She was quiet. Then, "Do you know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "Henry Dobbs. The clerk." She paused. He knew. He knew the whole time. He documented everything. And he still couldn't say it out loud. Not while Price was alive. Not while Orton was alive. Probably not after that either, because by then it had been too long, and he'd let it go on too long. She paused. He buried it instead. That's all he could do. He built the most careful thing he could, the best container he could find, and he put the truth inside it, and sealed it, and buried it where it couldn't be ignored forever. Marcus thought about the oilcloth wrapping, layer after careful layer. The pine pitch pressed into the lid seam. The white oak crate chosen for durability. A man building something to outlast himself because he couldn't face what needed to be faced while he was living, and he couldn't bear to let it disappear. He wanted it found, Marcus said. He wanted it found. That's why he buried it there, under the tree, where anyone looking for the truth of what happened there would eventually have to look. He could have buried it anywhere. He chose that spot deliberately. Yeah, he trusted time, she said. He trusted that eventually someone would come looking. And he built the container well enough that it would still be there when they did. Marcus looked out the window of the station house at the ridge above the valley. April sun on the high country, the last snow retreating, the year turning toward warmth again. He had walked this ground for 11 years, and he would walk it for more, because this was his work, and it was good work, and it had turned out to mean more than he had understood when he started. He trusted time, Marcus said. And it worked. Lily laughed, a small sound real. Yeah, she said. It worked. The land claim took longer than the historical determination. It was, as Renata Cruz had said it would be, complicated, not a matter of returning 40 acres to anyone, but a matter of establishing that the original transfer was fraudulent and pursuing remedies available under the applicable statutes. The current title holders were a timber holding company with no connection to Harlan Price, who had acquired the parcel through a chain of subsequent sales that stretched across 4 decades, and Patricia Reed, as the family's legal mind, understood that attacking the current holders was both practically difficult and morally questionable. What she pursued instead, with Renata Cruz's guidance, was a negotiated settlement, a process in which the history was formally acknowledged by all parties and a remedy was agreed to that fell short of title transfer but constituted meaningful recognition. It took 14 months, during which Marcus submitted 2 supplementary affidavits, and Dr. Osei's team produced additional documentation at the attorney's request, and Darlene Vasquez gave a formal recorded statement about her grandmother's correspondence with Clara. The settlement that emerged was not a perfect thing, but it was a real one. The timber company agreed to a formal acknowledgement of the fraudulent history of the parcel's acquisition, to be recorded with the county and included in the title history. They agreed to a modest financial settlement to the Reed family, the number not made public but described by Patricia as meaningful without being life-changing. They agreed to the removal of Harlan Price's name from the irrigation district feature that still bore it in the county's infrastructure records, a small thing that was also not a small thing. And they agreed to deed an easement across the property's northwest corner to the Blackwood Ridge Wilderness Corridor, a permanent conservation easement that had the practical effect of connecting 2 sections of the trail system that Marcus had been trying to connect for 6 years, and that his supervisor Hendricks had always said was not achievable because the land wasn't in public hands. It was in public hands now, in the only sense that mattered for the purpose. And when Marcus walked the new connector trail for the first time in late spring of the following year, the easement signed and recorded, the trail marked and cleared, he stood at the point where the old trail joined the new section and looked back down the drainage toward the hanging tree, visible at the edge of the clearing 300 yards below, and thought about the particular way that one thing connects to another across time, about the chain of it, The way a crate in the ground becomes a letter in a diner becomes a petition in Salem becomes a trail connection in the high country, about how none of it was predictable from any given point in the chain, and all of it was, in retrospect, exactly what was supposed to happen. He heard footsteps on the trail below and turned. Lily was coming up through the trees, her pack on her back, her notebook in her hand, her boots already muddy from the lower trail. She had driven up for the weekend specifically to walk the new connector with him, specifically to see the complete trail for the first time. She stopped beside him and looked where he was looking, down the drainage toward the Cottonwood. "You can see it from here," she said. "You can see it from here." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the naming," she said. "When the trail gets an official designation, what it should be called. I haven't thought about that yet." Lily looked at him. She had her mother's directness, his daughter, and she used it now. "The Elias Cutter Trail," she said. "That's what it should be called." Marcus looked at the tree below, the pale trunk, the bare branches, the sky above the clearing wide and blue in the late spring morning. He thought about 40 acres of good land with water rights, timber, and pasture both, a man who built his own fences and refused to sell them. He thought about what it meant to name something for a person who had been denied their name for 130 years. He thought about Clara going north and the letters stopping and Samuel setting it down and Eleanor planting Ruth's tree and Douglas reading his grandmother's journals and keeping them because he couldn't let them go to a landfill, about how much depended on the people who kept things, who held on, who preserved what others left. He thought about Henry Dobbs building a box. "Yeah," Marcus said. "That's what it should be called." He wrote the proposal that evening, formal, and documented the way proposals needed to be, and submitted it to the Trails Naming Committee the following week. It was approved 3 months later without objection, which was unusual for a naming proposal, but which Marcus had anticipated because he had been careful to attach the full historical determination to the proposal, and the committee members were not people who read the determination and came away thinking there was a counterargument to be made. The trail marker went up on a Thursday in August, a simple brown post with the name in the standard typeface, and Marcus drove out to it on the afternoon it was installed and stood beside it for a while. He took a photograph and sent it to Douglas and Patricia and James Reed, and to Renata Cruz and Dr. Osei, and to Darlene Vasquez in the Valley, and to Lily, who was at school in Oregon by now, 3 weeks into her first semester. She called within the hour. "It's good," she said. "Yeah, it is." She paused. "Marcus, I've been reading about the Harlan County Historical Society. They're putting together an exhibit on the Valley's history in the 1890s. "I know. They contacted me. Are you going to participate?" "I'm going to submit documentation. Dr. Osei is working with them on including the crate and the documents in the exhibit, or reproductions of them. The originals are in the state archive now." "Good." She paused again. "What about the tree?" He had been thinking about the tree. He had been thinking about it since before any of this started, in the way that you think about things at the edge of your attention before you understand what you're thinking about. The cottonwood was dead. It had been dead for decades, probably since before Marcus arrived in the district. Structurally, it was compromised, a liability in the terms his agency used, the terms that determined whether a dead tree in a public corridor constituted a hazard requiring removal or a habitat feature worth maintaining. He had filed the standard hazard assessment after Dr. Osei's team departed and had noted that the root system remained intact, that the trunk was stable, that the tree, despite being dead, showed no immediate risk of failing. He had filed the assessment and left the tree standing, which was within his discretionary authority, and he had not revisited the question because revisiting it would have required deciding something he was not ready to decide. "The hanging tree," Lily said. "I know. You can't just leave it unmarked," she said. "People hike past it now, more people than before, because of the trail connection. They see the cottonwood. They don't know what it is. I know they don't. So what are you going to do?" He looked out the window of the station house at the ridge, at the high country in the late August evening light, the days shortening now, the year beginning its turn. "Darlene Vasquez has been in contact with the Harlan County Historical Society," he said. "They want to put a marker at the site. A small one. Not a monument, just a marker, explaining what happened there." She was quiet. "There's a debate about what to call it on the marker," he said. "The hanging tree is what it's been called for 130 years, but some people think that name does more to memorialize the act than the person. Darlene thinks it should be called the Cutter tree." What do you think? I think Darlene is right. Lily was quiet for a long moment. Then, what does the marker say? What are the words? He picked up the draft he had been working on with the Historical Society, printed out, sitting on the kitchen table where he had been looking at it and revising it for 2 weeks. He read it to her. When he finished, there was a long pause. That's right, she said. That's exactly right. Her voice had something in it that he recognized as the particular emotion that comes when something has been done well, when the work has been done the way it needed to be done. Not happiness exactly. Something more like the feeling of a thing settling into its correct position. He held the draft in his hands and looked at it, at the words they had worked over for 2 weeks, and thought that she was right, that it was exactly right, that the words said what needed to be said about a man who had been taken from his land, and from his name, and from his daughter, and from his grandson, and from the chain of ordinary days that a man who built his own fences and buried his dog on his own ground had a right to live. Outside the window, the ridge was dark now against a sky still holding the last of the evening light, the high country in silhouette. And somewhere out there the trail ran north through the timber and across the drainage and connected to the new section that bore the name of the man who had built fences and refused to sell them. And the Cottonwood stood at the edge of its clearing, pale and patient and waiting, the way it had always waited, for someone to finally say what it knew. Darlene Vasquez drove out to see the marker installation herself, which Marcus had not expected but which he understood when she arrived, because some things required a witness and Darlene was the kind of person who understood that. She stood beside him at the edge of the clearing on a September morning while 2 men from the Historical Society set the post into the ground with the careful efficiency of people who had done this before, and she watched with an expression that was composed in the particular way of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and is watching it be set in its proper place. My grandmother would have wanted to be here, she said. She liked Elias Cutter. She told my mother that once, when my mother was young. She said he was a man who meant what he said and said what he meant, and that she had not known many such men in her life. She paused. She didn't know he was dead until after it happened. By the time word reached her, Clara was already gone. Marcus watched the men tamp the earth around the post. Did she try to find Clara? She wrote letters. Didn't know where to send them. She had a general idea about North Oregon maybe. That was all. She wrote a letter to the Oregon State Address Office and never heard back. She wrote letters that she couldn't send and kept them in the cedar trunk. Darlene paused. I found them when I found Clara's letters. My grandmother's letters to Clara that were never answered because she didn't know where to send them. They were in the same bundle. Marcus looked at her. She kept them together, Darlene said. My grandmother kept the unanswered letters beside the letters she had received, as though they were a conversation that had been interrupted rather than ended. She believed Clara was alive somewhere and had found a way to be all right, and that the silence was survivorship rather than loss. She paused. She may have been right. He thought about Clara writing from Morro Bay in 1901, 1902, 1904. 3 letters that had reached Darlene's grandmother and been saved in a cedar trunk. And Darlene's grandmother writing letters back that sat in a bundle for 120 years because the address had been lost somewhere in the space between a valley in Northern California and a coastal town in Oregon. She was right, Marcus said. Clara survived. She raised Samuel, and Samuel raised Eleanor, and Eleanor raised Douglas and Patricia and James, and Douglas kept his grandmother's journals because he couldn't let them go to a landfill. She was right. Darlene was quiet for a moment. Good, she said. Her voice was the same as Lily's when she said that word, the same quality of relief at the right answer arriving. Good. The post was in the ground. The men from the Historical Society were tidying their tools, and the marker stood at the edge of the clearing beside the Cottonwood with its name facing the trail, readable from 30 feet away in the standard typeface on the standard brown board, the same as every other trail marker in the Blackwood corridor except for what it said. The tree was behind it, the pale trunk, the bare branches, the rope cuts in the main limb visible from the ground if you looked at the right angle. The crows were in their rows on the upper branches, 7 of them this morning, watching with the indifferent patience they brought to everything. Marcus stood at the marker and read the words he had been reading in draft for 2 weeks, and they read differently with the post in the ground, in the clearing, with the tree behind them. They read the way words are supposed to read when they are in their right place, with a weight and clarity that the draft had held, but that the installation confirmed. Darlene stood beside him and read them too. When she finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "It says his name right," she said. "Yes," Marcus said. "It does." She nodded once, slowly, the nod of someone completing a long transaction. Then she turned and looked at the tree, at the rope cuts in the main limb, at the crows on the upper branches. "My grandmother used to say the tree knew," she said, "that it held what had happened to it the same way a person does." She was not a superstitious woman. She was practical, like most farm women of her generation. But she said that about the tree. She said some things get into the wood. Marcus looked at the tree. He thought about the oilcloth and the pine pitch and the crate in the ground, and the way the grass grew differently around the base, shorter and denser, the earth holding its memory the way the tree held its rope cuts. "I think that's right," he said. "I think she was right about that." Darlene looked at him. She had the direct, evaluating gaze of someone who had spent her life reading people quickly and accurately, and she used it on him now, the assessment brief and complete. "You're different than when you first came in asking about this," she said. He thought about that. Different how? She considered. "You came in asking about the tree like it was a record you needed to correct, a fact that had been filed wrong and needed refiling." She paused. "You're not asking about it that way now." "No," he said. "I'm not." "What changed?" He thought about Lily in the grass with her notebook, about Douglas in the diner with his hands flat on the table, about Eleanor Halverson recording birds at her kitchen window for 40 years, about Samuel setting it down so his daughter could walk forward, about Clara going north with a baby and a changed name and letters that eventually stopped. "I think I understood what it was about," he said. "I thought it was about the evidence. The crate, the documents, getting the record right." He paused. "That's part of it. But that's not all of it." Darlene waited. "It's about the people who kept it," he said. "The people who preserved things. Dobbs with his crate. My daughter with her notebook. Your grandmother with her cedar trunk. Douglas with his grandmother's journals. People who kept things they couldn't use yet, who trusted that someone would eventually come looking and that what they'd kept would matter." He paused. "That's what I didn't understand at first. The keeping is as important as the finding. Maybe more." Darlene was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My grandmother would have liked you." He wasn't sure how to respond to that. He said, "I think I would have liked her." They stood together a while longer in the clearing, in the September morning, with the marker in the ground and the tree behind it, and the crows watching from the upper branches. The meadow grass moved in a light wind coming down from the high country, the same wind that came down the drainage every morning, indifferent to the particular history of the ground it moved across, working the same way it had always worked regardless of what the ground remembered. Then Darlene said she needed to get back to the store, and Marcus walked her to the trailhead, and the clearing was quiet behind them with the marker standing at its edge, the pale cottonwood behind it, the sky above it wide and blue and ongoing. He went back to his work. The fall counts, the creek gauges, the campfire permits, the annual maintenance report that was due in October, and the equipment inventory that was due in November, and the corridor assessment that was due at year's end. He did his work with the steadiness that had always been his mode, and that meant something different now than it had meant before, not because the work was different, but because he understood it differently. Understood that steadiness applied across long time was its own form of preservation. That the act of showing up day after day and paying attention and recording what was true was not separate from what had happened with the crate and the documents and the reeds, but was the same thing, expressed in a different register. He thought about Elias Cutter building fences. Practical work. The kind of work that makes a place livable. The kind of work that looks like nothing from the outside and holds everything together from the inside. He thought about Clara Halverson writing letters. He thought about a clerk named Henry Dobbs building a box in the dark. He was not a man given to large declarations. He did not stand in clearings and make speeches to the sky. But he thought, driving back down the canyon road on a September afternoon with the cottonwood behind him and the valley ahead, that there was something to be said for the people who built things carefully and trusted them to time. Something to be said for the particular faith that required. The faith that truth had its own momentum if you built the container well enough and buried it deep enough and chose the right spot, the spot where someone looking for exactly this would eventually have to look. Henry Dobbs had chosen the right spot. Lily had looked. The rest had followed. The way these things follow when someone finally pays attention. The way the creek follows the grade. The way heat travels through buried clay. Not quickly, not easily, but with the patience of things that know where they are going. Marcus drove home through the canyon in the September light, and the valley opened below him, wide and ordinary and full of the particular history that ordinary valleys accumulate without anyone paying attention. And he thought that paying attention was the work, had always been the work, was going to keep being the work for as long as he was here to do it. He thought that was enough. He thought that was more than enough. He thought about calling Lily when he got home and telling her about Darlene and the marker and what Darlene had said about her grandmother and the tree, and about how Darlene had said he was different than when he first came asking, and about how he thought she was right about that, and about why. He thought Lily would understand why. He thought she probably already knew. The exhibit opened in March, 7 months after the marker went into the ground, in a building that had been the Harlan County Courthouse Annex in 1897 and was now the County Historical Society's main facility, a squat brick structure on the town square that smelled of old wood and preservation chemicals and the particular mustiness of rooms that hold too many documents in too little space. Marcus drove down for the opening on a Friday evening. Lily drove up from her university, a 4-hour trip she had not mentioned planning until she called him from the road, which was characteristic of her, the decision already made and the logistics already handled before the announcement. She arrived 20 minutes after he did, still in her field clothes from an afternoon lab session, mud on her boots, notebook under her arm, and she stood in the doorway of the main exhibition room and looked at the reproductions of the documents mounted on the display boards and was quiet for a long time. Douglas Reed was there with his sister Patricia and a woman introduced as Patricia's daughter, a lawyer in her 40s named Susan who had followed the land claim proceedings with the focused attention of someone deciding whether her profession might have uses she had not previously considered. James Reed had sent his regrets from Sacramento, a work obligation, but had sent a written statement that Darlene Vasquez read aloud during the opening remarks, a brief and careful statement that said the Reed family understood this evening as the beginning of something rather than the conclusion of something, because beginnings were more honest about what historical recognition actually was. Dr. Osei had made the journey and stood beside the display case that held the crate, the actual crate, on loan from the State Archive for the duration of the exhibit, sitting on archival foam under museum glass with a small card explaining its provenance and contents. She looked at it with the expression of someone for whom the object had become simultaneously familiar and strange, the way things become when you have studied them long enough to know them completely, and that knowledge makes them stranger rather than simpler. The exhibit was called, at the Historical Society's suggestion and the Reed family's agreement, A Name Restored. Marcus had proposed the name and Patricia had approved it without modification, which he had taken as a compliment. Darlene Vasquez delivered the opening remarks, which she had written herself, and they were exactly what you would expect from a woman whose family had been in the valley for 4 generations and who had absorbed its history the way a person absorbs weather, through exposure over time until the body knows what it knows without being told. She spoke for 12 minutes. She did not use notes. She said Elias Cutter's name 4 times, and each time she said it the room was slightly quieter, the particular quiet of people recognizing that a name is doing the work a name is supposed to do. Marcus stood near the back of the room beside Lily and listened and thought about the first time Darlene had said that name to him, across the counter in her general store with a honey jar between them, and how he had driven back to the station house with her account in his head and sat at the kitchen table without unpacking his supplies and felt the particular shame of willful incuriosity. The shame was gone now. What had replaced it was harder to name, not pride exactly, something quieter, something that had to do with having done the thing that needed doing even though the thing that needed doing had not been required by anyone or mandated by any procedure or built into the job description of a ranger who counted elk and monitored creek levels and checked campfire permits. He had done it because Lily had made him look and looking had made refusing to act impossible, and that chain of events, beginning with his daughter sitting under a tree with a notebook, had resulted in a man's name being right in the official record for the first time in 128 years. Renata Cruz stood beside Dr. Osei near the display case, and Marcus watched her watching the room, watching the Reeds, watching the people from the community who had come for the opening, locals, and some who had driven from a distance because they had heard about the case through the regional news coverage that had run in October, after the trail marker went up, a story that had been picked up and carried further than Marcus had anticipated. He had not sought the coverage and had not been comfortable with it, but had recognized that it served the purpose of the historical record in ways that discomfort was not sufficient reason to resist. The story had run in 3 regional papers and 1 national outlet that covered land rights and historical justice in the American West, and the version that ran nationally had brought a response Marcus had not anticipated: letters and emails to the Historical Society and to the Western Innocence History Project from people across the West who had similar histories in their own families, similar fractures in the lineage, similar silences that had been passed down without explanation, similar suspicions that something had happened in a place and a time that no one would talk about. Renata Cruz had told him the volume of contact was unusual, which was her way of saying significant, which was her way of saying that the case had touched something that turned out to be not singular. He had read some of the letters. Not all of them. There were too many, but some. They had a quality in common that he found difficult to articulate, but that he recognized: the quality of people who had been carrying something unresolved for a long time and who had found, in seeing a resolution that wasn't theirs, a permission to name what they carried. As though the public restoration of one name had opened a door that many people had been standing in front of without knowing they had the right to knock. He had mentioned this to Lily during one of their evening calls, and she had said, "That makes sense. When you see that it's possible, it becomes possible. Before that, it's just a shape in the dark that you can't make out." He thought about that now, standing in the back of the exhibition room listening to Darlene, and thought that was exactly right. That possibility required evidence of itself, that people needed to see something done before they could believe the doing was available to them. After the formal remarks, the room opened into the kind of conversation that happens when people who have come separately to a shared concern find themselves in the same space and realize that their separate concerns are not as separate as they thought. Marcus moved through the room talking to people he knew and some he didn't, answering questions about the discovery with the brevity that served him well, redirecting technical questions to Dr. Osei and legal questions to Patricia Reed and historical questions to Darlene with the efficiency of a man who had learned in the preceding 2 years exactly who knew what and who should be doing what talking. He found himself standing with Douglas Reed at the display case that held the crate, the two of them looking at it through the museum glass, the white oak darkened and hardened, the metal strapping still intact, the lid fitted back in place after the conservation work. A thing that had been in the ground for 127 years and that looked, under the glass, like exactly what it was: something built to endure. "I've been thinking about Henry Dobbs," Douglas said. Marcus looked at him. "I looked him up," Douglas said. "What I could find. He was court clerk in Harlan County from 1891 to 1908. He died in 1912. He had a wife and 2 children. There's a photograph of him in the county archive from 1905 or so." He paused. "He looks like a man carrying something." Marcus thought about that. He supposed they all looked like that. The people who carried things they couldn't set down and couldn't speak aloud. He supposed it made a particular mark. "I've been wondering whether he ever thought anyone would find it," Douglas said. "Whether he really believed someone would come looking, or whether he buried it hoping and suspecting that hope was not enough." Marcus considered this. He thought about what it meant to build the container that carefully, to choose the right wood, to seal it with pine pitch, to wrap the contents in layers of oilcloth, to choose the location with the deliberateness that the location required. That was not the work of a man who believed it would never be found. That was the work of a man who believed it would be found eventually, who had staked everything on. Eventually. "I think he believed it," Marcus said. "I think he had to believe it. Otherwise the work of building it would have been unbearable." Douglas was quiet. Then, he didn't know it would take this long. No, he couldn't have known that. 127 years. He died in 1912, and it wasn't found until last year. He spent his whole life with that knowledge, and it wasn't found until 60 years after his death. Marcus looked at the crate through the glass. Whatever Dobbs had felt about his choice, whatever he had thought in the years between the burial and his death in 1912, it was past recovering. What remained was the crate and the documents inside it, and the precision with which he had built it and sealed it and placed it, and the fact that it had been exactly where it needed to be when someone finally came looking. "He did it right," Marcus said. Whatever doubt he had, whatever he was carrying, he did the work right. Douglas looked at the crate for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "He did." Lily appeared at Marcus's elbow, as she often did, having finished a conversation somewhere else in the room and arrived without announcement. She looked at the crate through the glass with the same focused attention she had given the rope cuts in the cottonwood's main limb 2 years before, the particular look she had when she was filing something. She said to Douglas, "Have you been to the tree?" Douglas looked at her. "Not yet." He paused. "I've thought about it." "You should go," she said. "Not as an obligation. Just because it's where it started for his family. Where everything started." She looked at the crate. "Dobbs buried this there because it was already the place. Because what happened to your great-great-grandfather happened there, under that tree, and so that was where the truth belonged." Douglas was quiet. "When you go," Lily said, "I'd like to go with you. If that's all right." He looked at her, this 19-year-old who had sat down in the grass under a cottonwood with a notebook and noticed that the ground was funny, and he said, "I'd like that." Yes. They arranged it for the following morning, early, before the day's heat. The four of them, Marcus and Lily and Douglas and Patricia, who said she would not be left out of this, and said it with the firmness of a retired judge who was accustomed to that firmness achieving results. They met at the trailhead at 7 in the morning, the April air still cold, the high country above the valley still carrying snow in the north-facing gullies. Marcus led them down the trail he had walked for 12 years, through the lower drainage and along the creek, and up through the timber to where the trail bent north, and the hanging tree stood at the edge of the clearing 300 yards east. They walked without talking for most of it. Not uncomfortable silence, just the silence that trails encourage, the way moving through landscape redirects attention outward, toward the world rather than toward each other, and the world had enough to say that talking over it seemed rude. The cottonwood was visible from 200 yards out, pale against the tree-line, the same as it had always been, the same as it had been when Marcus walked past it for 11 years without asking its name. The marker post was beside it, the brown board with the white lettering readable from 50 yards, and as they came closer Marcus watched Douglas and Patricia read the words and watched their faces do the thing that faces do when words are exactly right in the place they occupy. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. The crows were there, 6 of them this time, in their rows on the upper branches. They watched the 4 humans with their standard indifference, which was to say with the attention of creatures that found humans interesting in the same general way they found everything interesting, which was not personal. The marker said what it said. Marcus had read it so many times in draft and in installation that he could have recited it without looking, but he read it again now, standing at the edge of the clearing with Douglas and Patricia Reed beside him, because it read differently every time, or he did, which amounted to the same thing. Patricia Reed read it, and was quiet for a long time. Then she walked forward, alone, and stood at the base of the cottonwood's trunk, and put her hand flat against the pale bark the way people put their hands against things that have witnessed something, as though the contact might transmit something back through the palm. She stood like that for a long moment. Douglas stood where he was and looked at the tree and at his sister at the base of the trunk, and Marcus looked at him and thought about Samuel Halverson setting it down so his daughter could walk forward, and thought that Douglas's daughter or Patricia's children might stand in this clearing someday with their own children and tell this story the way Darlene Vasquez told stories, matter-of-factly, with the authority of someone who had absorbed it through proximity rather than study, and that the telling would be different because the story would be complete, would have an ending that the telling could reach instead of trailing off into silence. Lily stood beside Marcus and said nothing. She was looking at the ground around the base of the tree, at the grass that still grew differently in its rough oval, shorter and denser, the earth's memory of the disturbance that had been made and filled. "The ground still knows," she said quietly. "Yes," Marcus said. "It does." Patricia came back from the tree and stood with her brother, and there was something in both their faces that was the same, the particular expression of people who have completed something long deferred, not happiness exactly, something more structural than that, something like the look of a room after it has been set in order after a long disorder, the look of things that have found their right place. Douglas said, "My mother would have wanted to be here." "Your grandmother, too," Marcus said. Douglas nodded. "And Samuel." He paused. "Even Samuel, who set it down. I think he would have wanted to know it was found. That someone came looking and found it." They stood in the clearing for a while, the 4 of them, in the April morning with the high country above them and the creek below them and the pale cottonwood at the center of it all, unchanged and changing, the same tree it had always been and different for being named correctly now, which was how all things were different when they were finally named correctly. Then Lily said she wanted to sit for a few minutes, and she sat at the base of the trunk with her notebook open on her knee, in the same posture she had been in when Marcus found her 2 years before on a July morning, and she began to write. Marcus watched his daughter write and felt something that took him a moment to identify. Gratitude was the closest word, but it wasn't quite right. Something more like the feeling of understanding why something happened the way it happened, the particular clarity that comes when you can see the whole chain from beginning to end and recognize the logic of it. Not fate exactly, not design exactly, but the coherent sense of one thing following from another in a way that could not have been predicted from any single point, and that was, in retrospect, exact. He thought about 12 years of walking past a tree without asking its name, and how that was ending differently than it would have if Lily had not come that summer, if she had not talked to Darlene Vasquez, if she had not gone back to the tree a second time and noticed the ground, if she had not come home and said, simply, the ground is funny. He thought about how much depended on people who noticed things and said them out loud without embellishment, who trusted that a plain observation made to the right person at the right moment was sufficient. His daughter was that kind of person. He was trying to become that kind of person. He thought he was getting closer. The drive back to the station house that afternoon was quiet in the way the walk down had been quiet, the landscape doing its work on the attention, the high country moving past the windows of the truck with the indifferent beauty of places that have no opinion about whether you understand them or not. Lily was in the passenger seat with her notebook closed on her knee and her eyes on the canyon walls. "You're going to write about this," Marcus said. "Not a question. Eventually." She looked out the window. "I don't know what form yet. Maybe a research paper on historical ecology and land rights. Maybe something else." She paused. "There's a larger pattern. The way land was taken from people in the 1880s and 1890s in this region, the mechanisms, the legal structures that enabled it, the erasure of the records. Elias Cutter is one instance of a pattern." She looked at him. Henry Dobbs preserved one instance of that pattern. But there are others. He had thought about this. After the national coverage ran in October, he had gotten an email from a historian at the State University who worked on land dispossession in the late 19th century American West. A woman named Akhtar who had been following the Cutter case and who had written to say that the Dobbs Journal was the most detailed contemporaneous record of the mechanics of fraudulent land acquisition she had encountered in 20 years of working the period. She had asked if she could access the conservation records. He had put her in contact with Dr. Osei. He told Lily about Professor Akhtar. Lily looked at him. "Have you talked to her yourself?" "Briefly. We've exchanged emails. You should talk to her more." She paused. The Dobbs Journal is part of a larger record, even if it's the most detailed piece of it. Understanding the pattern is how you prevent it from being forgotten again. Individual cases get forgotten. Patterns don't. Marcus thought about that. He thought about the letters to Renata Cruz after the national story ran, the people from across the West who recognized their own family silences in the shape of what had happened to the Cutters. He thought about Lily saying that when you see it's possible, it becomes possible. That possibility requires evidence of itself. "I'll call Professor Akhtar," he said. "Good." Lily looked back out the window. The canyon narrowed here, the creek close on the right side, rock walls close on the left, the sky a strip of blue above. Then it widened again, the valley opening, the station house coming into view at the end of the driveway. He pulled in and turned off the truck, and they sat for a moment in the quiet. He said, "When I started this, I thought it was about the crate. About getting something out of the ground and into the right hands." Lily looked at him. "It's not about the crate," he said. She waited. The crate was the beginning. But the work is the people. Finding the people, making sure the information reaches the people it belongs to. Making sure the reads know their history. Making sure the record says Elias Cutter's name right. Making sure the trail is named what it should be named. Making sure the marker says what it should say in the place where it should say it." He paused. The crate was the key. But the door it opened is much bigger than the crate. Lily looked at him for a long moment with her mother's directness. "You're different than you were," she said. He smiled. "Darlene said that too. Darlene is right." He looked at the station house, at the ridge above it, at the high country in the late afternoon light. "You made me look," he said. "I was walking past that tree for 12 years. You were ready to look," she said. "You just needed a reason." He shook his head. "You're being generous." She shrugged. "Maybe." She opened the truck door and got out, and then looked back in at him with the particular expression she had. straightforward, affectionate, slightly impatient with him in the way that she was sometimes impatient with him. The impatience of someone who thought he was better than he gave himself credit for and wanted him to stop underestimating himself. "Go call Professor Akhtar," she said, "and make dinner. I'm hungry." He made dinner, and he called Professor Akhtar the following morning, and that conversation went on for an hour and 20 minutes, which was not a thing that happened often with Marcus, who was brief by nature and preference. Professor Akhtar was a woman who asked questions in the way that made the person answering them want to keep going, who listened with the focused attention of someone for whom attention was a professional instrument, and who at the end of the call said she wanted to propose a collaborative project. "The Harlan County case," she said, "is significant not just as an instance, but as a model. If we can use the Dobbs documentation to reconstruct the mechanics of the fraud in detail, we can use that reconstruction as a template for identifying similar frauds in the adjacent counties in the same period." The methods were consistent. The personnel overlapped. The land agent Asa Webb worked the entire region. He paused. She paused. "He appeared in other county records," she said. "I found him in 3 adjacent counties between 1893 and 1901, which means there are probably other Elias Cutters." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He thought about the crate and the oilcloth and Henry Dobbs building a container for evidence he couldn't speak aloud, and he thought about what it meant to say there were other Elias Cutters, other families that had been split and sent away with changed names and silences that were passed down through the generations like heirlooms that no one wanted but no one could get rid of. "How do we find them?" he said. "The county land records," she said. "The trial transcripts, the probate records, the deed transfers in the years when Price and Webb were operating. We look for the pattern. Contested transfers, quick probate proceedings, names that disappear from the record after a conviction." She paused. "We look the way you looked. Carefully, and without assuming we already know what we'll find." He said yes. He said he would help in whatever capacity was useful, which turned out to be considerable, because the research required the kind of patient attention to physical terrain and county geography that was his particular competence, and because the station house sat in the middle of the area they were researching, and because he knew people in the surrounding counties through years of professional contact. People like Darlene Vasquez who held oral histories in the way that the earth held buried things, precisely and without expiration. The collaborative project took 2 years and found 4 additional cases for families in 4 adjacent counties whose land had been taken through fraudulent proceedings in the same period by the same network of men with the same mechanisms. 2 of those cases had surviving documentation analogous to the Dobbs Journal, court records that contained internal inconsistencies that the original courts had not examined. 2 had only circumstantial evidence, enough to note the pattern but not enough to amend the official record. All 4 had descendants who had been carrying something without knowing exactly what they were carrying. Marcus drove to 3 of the 4 families himself. He sat in kitchens and diners and living rooms and told stories that were hard to tell and harder to receive, and he watched faces do what Douglas Reed's face had done in the Newport diner, the combination of disbelief and recognition, and the particular weight of understanding that a silence had been protecting you from something that turned out to be both worse and more resolvable than the silence had suggested. The 4th family contacted him. A woman named Beatrice Olanrawaju, who had seen the coverage of the Cutter case and had spent 8 months researching her own family history before she found the thread. A great-great-grandfather named Joseph Olanrawaju who had homesteaded in the next county north in 1889 and who had died in a county jail in 1898 under circumstances the official record described as natural causes, but that the family had always understood differently. She had his letters. She had letters he had written to a cousin in the weeks before his death, and she had the cousin's letters back, and in that correspondence there was enough to tell a story that needed telling. Marcus connected her with Renata Cruz and Professor Akhtar and let the expertise of people who knew what to do with evidence do what it did. He thought often, during those 2 years, about what Lily had said about possibility requiring evidence of itself. He thought about how the opening of the Cutter case had opened something else, how the restoration of one name had made visible the need to restore others, how the particular shape of one family's history had given other families a template for understanding their own. He thought about the letters to Renata Cruz and the contact with Professor Akhtar and Beatrice Olanrawaju researching for 8 months before she called. And he thought that Henry Dobbs had perhaps understood something about this, that the preservation of one truth created the conditions for other truths to surface, that the container he had built held more than the documents inside it. Lily finished her first year of university and came back for the summer. Older in the way that the first year of university makes people older, which is not in years, but in the particular way the mind reorganizes itself when it is given enough room and enough challenge and enough other minds to push against. She was sharper and also softer somehow, more certain in her work and more openly uncertain about the larger questions, which was exactly the right direction for a person her age to be. Moving. She spent her first week back walking the Blackwood corridor from end to end, 3 days of it, camping at the upper meadow and at the creek drainage and at the point where the old trail joined the new connector section, the Elias Cutter Trail, the name on the marker at each junction reading with the same weight and clarity it always had. She came back to the station house on the 4th day with her notebook full and her boots destroyed and a look on her face that Marcus recognized as the look of someone who had come back from somewhere that mattered. She sat on the porch steps, and he brought her coffee and sat in the chair beside her, and they looked at the valley below in the evening light without talking for a while. Then she said, "I found something." He looked at her. In the timber above the upper meadow, northeast corner. She opened her notebook to a page covered in close, careful writing. There's a cleared area, not recent, probably mid-century or earlier, that looks like it might have been a homestead site. Stone foundation remnants. An old orchard, for apple trees, still producing, seriously overgrown. The soil disturbed in a regular pattern consistent with cultivation. Marcus frowned. That area should be documented in the district survey. It's not in the survey, she said. Or if it is, it's recorded as natural clearing without further notation. She looked at him. Someone lived there. Someone cleared that land and planted those apple trees and built a foundation. And at some point they left or were made to leave, and whoever came after didn't document who had been there. He looked at her notebook, at her careful notes, at the sketched map she had made of the site with measurements and compass bearings. He thought about Henry Dobbs building a container for evidence he couldn't speak aloud. He thought about Clara going north with a baby and a changed name. He thought about 4 additional cases in 4 adjacent counties and Beatrice Olamrawaja researching for 8 months before she called. He thought about Lily saying, "When you see it's possible, it becomes possible. The ground still holds things," she said. "We just have to keep looking." He reached for her notebook. "Let me see the map." She handed it to him, and he looked at her sketch, at the careful measurements and the compass bearings and the notes about the apple trees and the stone foundation, and he thought that they were starting something, which was both a familiar feeling and not familiar at all. The feeling of a beginning that you recognize as a beginning only because you have been to the end of something similar and learned what the beginning looked like from that vantage. He thought about 12 years of walking past a tree without asking its name. He thought about a girl sitting in the grass with a notebook. He thought about the crows in their rows on the upper branches, watching with the indifferent patience of creatures that had been there long before the question started and would be there long after. The valley below was going gold in the evening light, the creek catching the last of the sun, the ridge above in shadow, the whole long span of it ordinary and full of what it held. Marcus looked at Lily's map and started asking questions. The work continued the way good work continues, not dramatically, not in a single direction, but spreading outward from the original point of contact the way water spreads from a stone dropped in still water, each ring larger than the last, each one moving further from the center, but still connected to it, still carrying the energy of what had been dropped and where it had fallen. Professor Akhtar published the collaborative research in a journal that Marcus did not read regularly, but that Lily sent him a copy of, flagging the sections where his name appeared in the acknowledgments. And the publication brought more contact, more people who had recognized their family silences in the shape of what had been documented, more threads to follow. He followed what he could, referred the rest to people better equipped to follow them, and kept doing his regular work in the corridor between the contacts. The County Historical Society made the exhibit permanent, which Marcus had not anticipated but which Darlene Vasquez had predicted with the confidence of someone who knew how communities processed their own histories. The crate was returned to the State Archive after the loan period ended, but a full-scale reproduction was made and installed in its place, and the display case held it with the same care the original had received, which was appropriate, because a reproduction of a thing can carry the truth of the thing if it is made precisely enough and placed in the right context. Douglas Reed visited twice more in the year that followed, once with his daughter and once with his brother James, and both times he walked the Elias Cutter trail to the Cottonwood and stood at the marker and read the words and spent time at the base of the trunk the way Patricia had stood there at the opening, with his hand against the bark. He brought the compass that his grandmother Eleanor had kept on her windowsill beside the bird journal, a small brass compass with a crack in the crystal, and he hung it from a low branch of the cottonwood on his second visit. Marcus found it there on his rounds the following week and left it where it was. It was still there the last time he walked past, turning slowly in the wind off the high country, the needle inside finding north the way it had always found it, indifferent to the crack in the crystal, pointing the direction it had always pointed, which was not sentimental, but was the most useful thing a compass could be. Marcus Cole turned 42 that year, which was the age Elias Cutter had been when he was hanged under the cottonwood in October 1897, and he noted the coincidence without assigning it meaning, because he was not a man who assigned meaning to coincidences. But he noted it, which was its own form of acknowledgement, the kind that doesn't require language, the kind that happens in the part of a person that keeps track of things without being asked to. He walked the trail on his birthday, alone, in the October morning that was the same kind of morning it had been when Elias Cutter died, cold and clear, the high country in its autumn colors above the valley, the creek running full from the early rains. He walked the full corridor from the southern trailhead to the upper meadow and back, 12 miles, the route he had walked more times than he could count, and at the cottonwood he stopped and stood at the marker for a while and read the words. He thought about a man who built his own fences and buried his dog on 40 acres of good land and understood that some things were worth refusing. He thought about what it meant to be 42 years old and to have your name restored to you, even posthumously, even by people you had never met, even across a distance of 128 years. He thought it meant something. He thought it meant that the keeping had been worth it, that Dobbs's container had done its work, that the earth's memory was not nothing. He stood there long enough that the crows came back, 4 of them this time, settling into the upper branches with the ruffling adjustment of creatures making themselves comfortable, and then they were still, watching, the way they watched everything, with the patient indifference that was not actually indifference, but was something that looked like it from below. Marcus looked at the compass turning on its branch. He looked at the marker with the name on it. He looked at the pale trunk and the rope cuts in the main limb and the grass growing differently around the base. He thought about Lily's voice saying, "The ground still holds things. We just have to keep looking." He put his hand against the bark, the way Patricia had done, the way Douglas had done, and the bark was cold and dry under his palm and felt like nothing except bark, and also like everything it had witnessed, which was a great deal, and the two things were not contradictory. He took his hand away and readjusted his pack and turned back toward the trail, toward the 12 years of work that remained and the work that would follow that, toward the corridor with its elk and its creek levels and its campfire permits and its old orchards in northeast corners and its foundations that didn't appear in surveys, toward the long, patient attention that the land required and that he had finally understood was also what it deserved. The trail ran north, and he walked it, and behind him the cottonwood stood at the edge of its clearing in the October morning, pale and patient, named at last, the marker beside it saying what it said in the standard typeface on the standard brown board, ordinary and exact, the way truth is ordinary and exact when it finally arrives in the place it belongs. The crows watched him go. The creek ran. The high country held its light. The valley continued, the way valleys continue, through everything that happens in them and everything that is buried in them and everything that is eventually found, carrying forward the accumulated weight of what the land remembers, which is everything, which has always been everything, which will keep being everything long after the last person who knows the story is gone, held in the soil and the bark and the particular way the grass grows differently over ground that has been disturbed and never entirely healed, which is to say, the same as it has always grown, which is to say, with the patience of things that do not need to be understood to be true. There were other things Marcus kept from that year, not objects exactly, more like the residue of conversations that settle into the mind and stay there the way certain smells stay in a room long after their source is gone. He kept what Renata Cruz had said to him after the state board's determination came through, when he had called her to relay the news, and she had been quiet for a long moment, and then said, "This is what the work is for. Not the win, not the record amendment, not the resolution. The moment when the family knows. When the knowing passes from the archive into the living." He kept what Dr. Osei had said to him the last time she visited the exhibit, standing beside the reproduction of the crate under its glass, when she had said that the most remarkable thing about the Dobbs documentation was not the evidence it contained, but the faith it represented, the faith of a man who believed that truth had a future even when his present gave him no evidence of that. He kept what Douglas Reed had said on the phone 3 months after the Newport diner, after the petition was filed and the research was underway and the trail naming proposal was submitted, when he called Marcus on a Tuesday evening to say that his daughter had asked him about the Cutter history at dinner that night, and he had told her the whole story for the first time, and she had listened without interrupting, which was not her usual mode. And when he finished, she had said, "So we're Cutters? Really? Underneath everything?" And Douglas had said yes. Underneath everything, yes. He kept what Lily had said on the porch on the evening she came back from the upper meadow, when he had asked her why she kept going back to the Cottonwood, kept sitting under it, kept writing in her notebook at its base, and she had said, "Because being there reminds me that the work is real. That paying attention to a place is not a metaphor. It's a practice. You go back to the same place, and you pay the same quality of attention, and eventually you understand something you couldn't have understood without the returning." He thought about that often. The returning, the 12 years of walking past, and the one morning of sitting down, and the recognition that the quality of attention changed what was visible, that the ground did not reveal itself to the distracted, that the grass growing differently in its rough oval had been there all along, and had only become visible when someone sat close enough to the ground to notice it. He thought about what it meant to practice attention, not as a virtue but as a discipline, the way physical disciplines require regular return, the way you could not accumulate the understanding through a single visit, but only through the pattern of visits over time, each one adding to what the previous one had built, the knowledge growing the way the ring grows on the tree, one season at a time, each ring thin on its own and the aggregate of them substantial. He had been practicing attention for 12 years in the Blackwood corridor. He had thought he was practicing it well. He had been missing the most significant feature in his district. He was practicing better now. The summer Lily turned 20, she came back for 2 weeks, and they spent most of them in the field, working the new sites she had flagged on her extended walk the summer before, the homestead in the northeast corner above the upper meadow, and 2 other sites she had identified in her first year of university study. A midden near the creek drainage that the district survey had noted as geological feature without further examination, and a spring box in the upper timber that bore markings consistent with human construction rather than natural occurrence. They worked carefully and methodically, documenting before touching, photographing before measuring, the discipline of people who understood that a site's context was as significant as its contents, and that disturbing context without documentation was a form of destruction. Lily led the work with the focused competence of someone who had spent a year learning to do this properly and was applying that learning with the seriousness it deserved. She found nothing in the midden that significantly altered the district's understanding of the corridor's human history. She found something in the spring box. Pressed into the underside of the box's cover, held in place by a strip of rawhide tied through 2 holes that someone had drilled in the wood, was a folded paper. Old, water-damaged at the edges, but legible in its center, written in a careful hand with ink that had faded to the color of weak tea. It was not a deed. It was not a journal. It was a letter addressed to no one in particular, beginning without salutation, the kind of letter that is addressed to whoever finds this, or to the future, or to God, or to the idea that someone might eventually look. It said, "I have lived on this water since 1878, and I built this box with my own hands, and the spring is good water, and I am leaving because they say I have to leave, and I don't believe they have the right to say it, but I'm leaving because my daughter is 6, and she is worth more than being right. I am setting this down so that whoever comes after knows the water was here before them, and someone built this box, and the spring is good." No name, just the letter and the date, 1891, and the spring box with its good water still flowing 130 years later, still doing the work it was built to do. The wood of the box darkened and swollen with moisture, but intact, the rawhide dried, but holding, the letter inside it preserved by the particular luck of dry wood over wet stone. Marcus and Lily read it together, kneeling beside the spring box in the upper timber in the July afternoon light, and when they finished neither of them said anything for a while. Then Lily said, "A daughter. 6 years old," Marcus said. 1891. She sat down rather than carried, Lily said quietly. The exact words. She wrote the letter and left it in the box and took her daughter and went, and she said she was setting it down, and she meant the grievance, and she also meant the letter itself. She set it down in the wood and trusted the wood. He looked at the letter in his hands. He looked at the spring water moving over the lip of the box with the steady indifference of water that has been moving in the same direction for 150 years and intends to keep moving in that direction regardless of what the people above it decide about each other. "We don't know who she was," he said. "We know she was here." Lily's voice was careful. "We know she built this box. We know the water was here before them, whoever them was." She paused. "We know she had a daughter, and she chose the daughter over being right." He thought about Clara and Samuel. He thought about the particular courage of choosing a living child over a dead grievance, of setting down what you cannot carry without setting down the person who needs you to keep walking. "We'll document it," he said. "File it with the Cultural Resources Office. See what the county records show for this section in the 1880s. "Yes." Lily looked at the letter. "And we'll tell people she was here." "Yes. We'll tell people she was here." He filed the documentation the following week, and the research took 3 months and found a partial record. A land claim filed in 1879 in the name of a woman identified in the county ledger only as Mrs. A. Corrigan, which was how women were frequently recorded in the period, the husband's initial and surname, the woman herself reduced to a marital status, and a man's name. The claim had been disputed in 1890, and the dispute had been resolved in 1891 in favor of a timber company, which was consistent with the letter's date and content, and which told a story that was familiar in its shape, if not in its particulars. Mrs. A. Corrigan, who had built a spring box with her own hands and lived on good water since 1878, and left a letter in the box when she left because her daughter was 6 and worth more than being right. They did not find her daughter. They did not find what happened to Mrs. A. Corrigan after 1891, or where she went, or whether the daughter survived into adulthood. The record did not preserve those things. But the letter was preserved, and the spring box, and the water that had been running over the lip of the box since before Marcus was born, since before his father was born, since the woman who built it had knelt beside this spring in the upper timber and understood that water did not require anyone's permission to be good. Marcus added the spring box to his regular patrol route. He visited it on his rounds every 2 weeks, noting the water level and the condition of the box and the state of the surrounding timber, and each time he noted it, he also noted, in his field log, the name he had given it after the documentation was filed, which was the Corrigan Spring, because a spring without a name was just water and a spring with a name was a piece of history. And the difference between those two things was the difference between forgetting and remembering, which was the difference between the past and the future. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing. It was the kind of thing that the work consisted of, day after day, the patient accumulation of named things in the ledger of what had happened here, the slow building of a record that told the truth about who had been where, and what they had built, and what had been taken from them, and what they had set down when they had to choose between the thing and the person, between being right and being here. He thought Elias Cutter would have understood that choice. He thought Clara understood it. He thought Mrs. A. Corrigan had understood it the morning she pressed her letter into the underside of her spring box lid and tied the rawhide through the drilled holes and left, with her 6-year-old daughter beside her, into whatever came next. He thought Henry Dobbs had understood it differently, had made a different choice, had been unable to leave and unable to speak, and had built his container and buried it under the tree that held what he could not say, and had spent his life from 1897 to 1912 carrying the weight of what he knew, and had died with it, and had trusted the earth. The earth had held it. Marcus held it now, all of it, the whole complicated accumulation of it, not as a burden, but as the work, as the thing that the years of patient attention had been building toward without his knowing it, as the reason that 12 years of walking the same ground had a meaning beyond the walking. He thought that was enough. He thought it was more than enough. He walked his district in the October light, and the valley held the late season with the particular beauty of things that have reached the end of their yearly cycle and are ready to turn. The aspens gold in the canyon, the creek running with the first real rains, the high country cooling toward what it would become in November, and he walked through it with the attention it deserved. The full weight of his attention applied to everything the land held. The visible and the not yet visible, the documented and the not yet found, the named and the still waiting for their names. Somewhere in the timber above the upper meadow, in a northeast corner that didn't appear in any survey, for apple trees that someone had planted and tended and abandoned were carrying their fruit through another October, indifferent to whether anyone came to pick them, doing what they had always done, which was to bear what they bore and let it fall when it was ready and trust the ground to hold the seeds against the following spring. The ground held. It always held. Marcus walked on. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.